Hi, today we're going to go through some herbicide considerations for 2026. This slide set was originally shared at a series of weed schools held throughout Northwest and Southwest Kansas in mid-February. The outline for today is to start with a few product updates. We'll give some herbicide resistance updates, and then we'll talk a little bit about cost-effective chemical weed control for 2026. As far as the weed guide is concerned, you can use the QR code here or the website listed here to download a digital copy of the 2026 Chemical Weed Control Guide. That information can also be found on the back cover of your hard copy. So if you don't have your hard copy yet, please do get one from your local K-State Extension office. And I think the digital copy is a great thing to have. One of the things that we are working on for 2026 is to update that digital copy to include information about the approval for the over-the-top dicamba products that are labeled for use in dicamba-tolerant soybeans and cotton. So we will add that information here in the coming week or two. Speaking of the new dicamba products, this is an example of some information for the 2026 registrations. Bayer has changed the name of their product to Striax. They do have the label up in the online label databases like CDMS and Agrian and Green Book now. The Ingenia label is up there as well. Some key things to remember here is that the application timing cutoffs, that calendar date has been removed. So now we have some growth stage cutoffs, which is R1 in soybeans, and then anytime before cotton harvest. But the key things here that are going to make these labels a little more tricky are the temperature restrictions. So below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, there are no temperature restrictions. Above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, no applications are permitted for these over-the-top dicamba products. But between 85 and 95 degrees, there is a limitation that only 50% of a farmer's acres of dicamba tolerant crops can be sprayed on any one day if the temperatures on that day or the next day are predicted to be between 85 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is going to create some complications for planning and logistics. The total application rate permissible per year is 1 pound of dicamba for all dicamba containing products, not just for these over-the-top products. Other things to keep in mind, I just recognized I have a typo on this slide. The label does not prohibit application with any particular herbicides. It does prohibit application with AMS, which effectively means Liberty is not a viable tank mix partner for these over-the-top dicamba herbicide applications. There is some additional language about specific types of drift reduction agents that must be included. What I'm seeing there is that the required rate is going to be 3% volume per volume. Other things to keep in mind are that these applications will need at least 3 runoff mitigation points per the herbicide strategy. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that especially on the drift side, some of the mitigation measures that are listed on the EPA's herbicide strategy site are not listed as qualifying mitigation measures for these over-the-top dicamba containing products. That information will be covered in some of the trainings that the companies will be having that folks will need to have in order to apply these products. As far as truly new products for the weed guide, this here is really the closest thing that we have to a new product. This product is called Entrava DX. It is a premix of metribuzin, so Sencor, and another herbicide called amikarbazone. Amicarbazone is not included in any other corn herbicides at this time. So this is Intrava DX. Two key things to realize about this product are that it is only labeled in corn and can only be applied before planting. The application timings and the soil restrictions for this product do line up with restrictions for metribuzin use ahead of corn. The application rates here, there's a wide range listed on the labels. Here in the Manhattan area, my team has evaluated this product at 12 and 16 ounces to the acre. I will tell you we have excellent weed control at both of those rates. However, we did see some crop response at the 16 fluid ounce rate. So if I were to make a recommendation, I would probably be leaning more towards that 12 ounce rate for this particular product. I did include a small QR code on this slide here to remind me to tell you guys that we did do an episode of the War Against Weeds podcast with some folks from UPL, as well as Aaron Hager from the University of Illinois, talking about Group 5 herbicides, including atrazine, metribuzin, and amicarbazone. The next group of products are coming from Corteva. The first one is called Sonic Boom. This product is very similar to a UPL product called Preview. It's also similar to Authority MTZ. As you might expect, though, in the Authority product, the rate of sulfentrazone is a little bit higher. So Sonic Boom is a premix of metribuzin and sulfentrazone. It is similar to the Corteva product Sonic, except that Sonic has first rate plus metribuzin rather than sulfentrazone or Spartan plus metribuzin. This is a good pigweed product. It can be applied in the fall or for spring burn down and does also have a fallow label. This combination of metribuzin and sulfentrazone, I think, is, if you haven't looked at it as a fallow type of application, is definitely something worth considering if your rotation back to corn will allow the rates. The next new Corteva product is Kyber Pro. And honestly, this is not a new product. This is the exact same product as Kyber. Also the same product as Fierce MTZ. It's a combination of Valor, so flumioxazin, Cencor, so metribuzin that we've been talking about, and Zidua, which is pyroxasulfone. So Kyber Pro, same application timings that you saw with and rates that you saw with Kyber, just a slightly different formulation. So they did adjust the name here. The last Corteva product we have to look at is Novagraze. This is a range and pasture product built around a herbicide called fluorpyroxafen, which is a group 4 herbicide that does also have some grass activity and is actually safe on some annual legumes, some desirable legumes. So that is one potential benefit. However, in this particular product, they did include some 2,4-D with it. So we have not evaluated this product to talk about weed control or that crop safety piece at all. The next two products are from New Farm, and they are based around a new salt of 2,4-D. The 2,4-D amine products that we see on the market today are a dimethylamine product. So the 4-pound 2,4-D amines are DMAs. This is going to be a 6-pound 2,4-D amine product, and it is a combination of that DMA salt as well as an MMA or monomethylamine salt. And really the key differences here are that the chemistry of that MMA molecule just plays a little bit nicer, and so it allowed them to increase the loading of 2,4-D in these products. So similar application timings and similar total pounds of 2,4-D here. Weed Master XHL is the same idea, but it includes a greater rate of dicamba as well as that higher rate of 2,4-D that MMA salt allows. The last product to talk about here is Liberty Ultra. I did want to point out that we were able to increase the maximum labeled rate for Liberty Ultra in 2026 to 34 fluid ounces per acre. That's the key change there on that label for folks to be aware of. Other things to be aware of, we mentioned the herbicide strategy with the dicamba labels. Liberty Ultra is compliant with the herbicide strategy. And if you're watching this video and you feel compelled, we would like to know how you think the herbicide strategy is affecting your operation. This effort is funded by the United Soybean Board. And really, the background here is that we believe, with some input from folks that are working hard on the herbicide strategy with the EPA, that one of the best things Extension can do is help gather feedback from farmers on the herbicide strategy. So the survey is 8 questions. It should take you about 5 minutes. Most of them are ranking things on a scale of like 1 to 10. So if you would take a moment now or at the end of this presentation to scan that QR code, we would be very grateful. The next thing we need to talk about here are some other changes to the chemical weed control guide. We did add information on forage sorghum. I want to bring that up, partly because this is a great example of how our extension weed science team takes feedback from crop consultants and other users of our information to try to make it better. So if you have some feedback for us, please do let us know. The request that was made was to add an entire forage sorghum section, but due to how the book is published, we don't have that many pages to add. So we added a column in the efficacy chart in the grain sorghum section. So folks can quickly look and see if a particular herbicide is labeled in forage sorghum in addition to grain sorghum. We added some more information about efficacy of residual herbicides in fallow situations. We added some information about devil's claw to the cotton section. We added some pre-emergence herbicide information to the spring oat section. And then we actually probably took out more products than we added this year. Key ones to think about on that list, the Resicor removal is just a response to how Corteva changed the Resicor formulation over the last couple of years. There should no longer be Resicor in the marketplace. It should all be Resicor Rev in the marketplace at this time, which is the same active ingredients, same loading rates, just different formulations. Another one that caused a little more stir than I really expected was the removal of Post. Um, my understanding is that BASF is no longer going to be manufacturing Post. However, they are looking for buyers to keep that molecule in the marketplace. The next thing we should visit about are our herbicide resistance screening efforts. This work is largely funded by soybean dollars, and so most of the samples we collected during the first year, which was 2024, so the data we're going to look at are from samples collected in 2024. And most of those samples did come from kind of central and eastern Kansas just because we were targeting soybean fields. Some populations of concern that we have found. We had populations in Anderson, Cherokee, and Wabunsee counties that had more than 50% survivors of a 1x rate of Liberty Ultra applied in the greenhouse. We have not done the dose response studies to confirm that resistance, but my advice to farmers in those locations would be to assume, at least in those fields, to assume a level of glufosinate resistance and make sure that you're using multiple effective herbicides with your post-emergence herbicide applications. Another population that we are investigating a little bit further is a population out of Jefferson County that had more than 50% survivors of Liberty Ultra and more than 50% survivors of Enlist One. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more. We collected samples from that same area in 2025, and we will be digging into that as well. I will say, my advice to that farmer also was to proceed as if he did have resistance to those populations in the absence of that official confirmation. Just to look at the numbers overall in a little bit different way, um, you can see there the Liberty Ultra had the most the greatest number of populations that had a what we considered a herbicide failure or poor control. So those percentages there represent the number of survivors that were present in the population. So the most survivors were present in Liberty Ultra, second most survivors, um, second greatest number of populations with survivors was in list one. And then Extendamax, we did not have any populations that we classified as a herbicide failure or poor control in those 2024 samples. We do know we have some dicamba resistance in Palmer amaranth in Western Kansas. So as we expand our sample collection west, we anticipate that that number may change. Another thing we need to talk about here is PPO resistant kochia. So this is a map from 2022. My friend and colleague, Dr. Eichele, shared this information with me in 2022, and they were first finding kochia populations that they were not able to control with group 14 or PPO resistant herbicides. And we'll talk about some of the data that goes behind this here in just a minute. Fast forward 3 years, this is the map from 2025, so essentially the current map that they have for the state of North Dakota. We also know there are some populations in South Dakota, and here is the map for Canada. Okay, so you see that blue area in there. The 2021 populations that they had were in the blue areas. The areas that are shaded in red represent the 2025 samples. So this is something that is spreading very rapidly in the northern plains. And we have reason to think that we might have some populations here in Kansas that are of concern based on some survey work that was done by Dr. Shergill at Colorado State. So here's some of the data that the NDSU folks developed during that 2022-2023 winter. So you can see here on this slide the herbicides that they evaluated. They have on these this particular kochia population, they have a non-treated check in the lower left-hand corner. And then they have the diphenyl ether PPOs, so Ultra Blazer, Flexstar, and Cobra are still working quite well. Post-emergence applications of Spartan and Valor had some suppression, but look at Sharpen, Reviton, Beta, and AIM with essentially, very little control compared to that non-treated check. So just a reminder here, I think it's important to consider herbicide groups when we think about mixing and rotating. But for some of these cases of resistance, as we're starting to learn more about them, we're seeing that understanding herbicide families can be just as important as understanding herbicide groups. So these are three different herbicide families within the PPO inhibiting herbicide, so within group 14. And you can see that Cobra, Reflex, and Ultra Blazer are in the same family and they are still effective, whereas those other two herbicide families have lost effectiveness. I would point folks to another resource, and that would be the Take Action herbicide charts. And on that chart, you can also see, you can see in addition to herbicides grouped by their modes of action, the herbicide families are listed on that chart as well. So that could be a good tool to start to become familiar with some of these herbicide families as we think about managing herbicide resistance going forward. And we can provide the link for that Take Action chart and some of the supporting materials for this recording. It can be, if you search up online, Take Action Against Resistance and herbicide chart, you should be able to find a place where you can order as many copies of this as you need. So here's some additional information here about these populations just to show you they do know how to kill kochia in the greenhouse. The susceptible populations were successfully killed at both the 1x and 2x rates of Sharpen here in this picture. And you can see that Sharpen resistance is prevalent or present in multiple of these populations. They also looked at some extremely high rates of Sharpen. So a 100x rate of Sharpen, 100 ounces of Sharpen. And this kochia is still regrowing in the greenhouse. This is the piece actually, though, that is most concerning for me as we think about kosher resistance in Kansas. And that is the fact that they also have resistance to pre-emergence applications of these products. So in this case, they planted the seeds, they sprayed the pots on the same day. And you can see the non-treated control in the front. And then the Spartan had some level of control, but the flumioxazin or the Valor, all of those kochia populations, with the exception of number 7, had a number of plants that survived the application. So this resistance to pre-emergence applications of flumioxazin, I think, is really important to keep our eyes on as we think about managing kochia going forwards. So just as a reminder, resistance to a pre-emergence residual herbicide looks like usually a shorter period of weed control. So if you apply a product and you expect to get 4 weeks of control out of it, but you only get 10 days, that's when we need to start thinking about resistance and start thinking about collecting some seeds and working on identifying whether or not that population is resistant. I included this picture as well just to show that these are the susceptible populations. So those same rates of Spartan and Valor, you can see that the susceptible population was controlled in that study. So it's not, again, it's not a greenhouse error. Those plants really did have likely resistance. We did recently record a podcast about those populations with BASF, so that will be available soon on the War Against Weeds website if folks want to get some more information about those populations. Okay, let's transition into thinking about plans for 2026 and really just, good kind of weed management economics in general, right? I think probably most of the folks listening to this recording understand that, especially with weeds like Palmer amaranth, we really have one chance to get our weed control program right, and that is with our pre-emergence or our at planting herbicide applications. And so as we think about cutting budgets, I would ask folks to think about, the analogy I've been using is to trim this budget with a scalpel rather than with a chainsaw here, right? We're going to make some fine cuts. We're going to look for some less expensive alternatives, but we're going to keep at least two effective soil applied residual herbicides in our programs for pigweed control. I've been using this data to make this case. This data does come from Wisconsin and it is looking at water hemp, but we can make a similar comparison with Palmer amaranth in Kansas. Okay. So the way you look at this data, well, I guess first the backstory on this data is Dr. Worley's team basically sprayed every residual herbicide labeled for use in corn. Then they categorized them as to whether the herbicide had one site of action, two sites of action, or three herbicide sites of action. So if you start at the bottom of the chart with those single site of action products, that red circle shows the variability in the data that they collected there. So all the way from like 10% control up to 100% control. So sometimes they got lucky, they got good control. Other times they did not. But you see that letter B in the middle, that indicates that statistically we can predict that 95% of the time a single herbicide site of action will provide less weed control than a herbicide program that has two effective sites of action. Okay, so then look at the green dots. That's two effective sites of action. So you can see there's a letter A in there, so that means it will have better control than a single site of action. But that green circle also, there are some data points down there between 25 and 50% control. And I feel pretty confident saying that that's probably not satisfactory weed control for most of the folks listening to this recording. So I would argue that there is still some risk associated with using only two effective sites of action. However, when we move up to three sites of action, you can see that circle also has a letter A in it. So we can't predict that 95% of the time we will see better weed control when we go from 2 to 3. But when I look at this data and I look at the spread of that data, right, there are really no data points in blue that are below the 75% mark there. So we have a lower risk of failure in this case, even though on the high side, there weren't a lot of differences. So I think we can make an argument that 3 herbicide sites of action are better than 2 herbicide sites of action for our pre-emergence programs. Now, where I would offer you some budgetary considerations are that if you're in a field where you know you've had a history of excellent pigweed control, and you feel confident about your ability to get a good crop canopy, to get residual herbicides activated well, maybe that's a place where we could say this is where we'll save some money and only go with 2 herbicide sites of action. But if you're in a situation where you know you have a very dense population of pigweeds, where you are concerned about getting residual herbicides activated, or you're afraid your crop may take longer to canopy, that is where those 3 herbicide sites of action, I think, are very important. I put this information together just based on things that are in the chemical weed control guide. So thinking about products that have, kind of better efficacy on either pigweeds or kochia, thinking about some rates that folks might look at, the price that we listed in the chemical weed control guide, which I will freely tell you that that's probably higher than what most folks are going to be able to get from their local retailer. And then considering the price per acre for those products at that application rate. So, things to think about here. I learned dicamba as a post-emergence product, but we do know that it does have some residual activity on kochia and pigweeds. So that could be an effective way to put a product in there that has a very low requirement for precipitation to be activated. Metribuzin, we talked about several times. I don't know if you guys picked it up, but metribuzin was in every single one of the new products that we talked about for the chemical weed control guide this year, with the exception of that rate change in Liberty Ultra. So metribuzin is a direction that a lot of folks are looking. It can be priced pretty comparably to an atrazine application. The group 15 products, there are some differences in effectiveness there, especially as we think about drier environments and rainfall required for activation. Also, lots of differences in price points there. So that I think folks need to kind of consider that. And then the other one that is a very attractive price point down there is mesotrione or Callisto, right? We can apply that for about $5 or $6 an acre at a rate that would be effective on pigweeds and kochia. So, I mentioned metribuzin. Why are we looking at metribuzin a lot? Number one, compared to atrazine, metribuzin does not exhibit enhanced degradation. So enhanced degradation is that phenomenon where the bacteria in the soil become adapted to atrazine, and so they're able to break it down faster if there's a history of application in a particular field. So there's no enhanced degradation to metribuzin reported. We do know that depending on the type of resistance, metribuzin can have activity on atrazine-resistant pigweeds and kochia. We also know that metribuzin, because it targets the same site of action in the plant, it has the same type of synergy with our bleaching herbicides and with paraquat that we see with atrazine. So it has a lot of potential. We did do some studies. This is data from a multi-state study, again, funded by soybeans, but I think it shows a key point here. We had several rates of metribuzin. We went from 4 dry ounces per acre up to a pound per acre, so 16 ounces per acre. And when we looked at the data, we got excellent pigweed control and less than 5% soybean injury when we used 10 ounces of tricor. So in this case, we were looking at 10 ounces of tricor compared to 10 ounces of Spartan or sulfentrazone product, and then a pint and 2/3 of dual magnum. So the thing to look at here, on the left-hand side of this slide, we have the pigweed control in our kind of normal environments, and on the right-hand side, we have pigweed control in our drier environments. The thing I want to point out here is that the metribuzin treatment was able to provide good, not excellent, but good pigweed control, even in those dry environments before rainfall was received that was activating for the other herbicides. So metribuzin could have a fit as an alternative in some drier environments for residual activity against pigweeds. As I started talking about metribuzin this winter, questions were coming up about metribuzin in corn. So here's some information from um, a label from a dry metribuzin product. Similar to that Intrava label, you can apply up to 30 days before corn planting. The rate there is up to 5 ounces, but you do need to be cautious of soil texture and soil organic matter there. Soil pH is listed on the label as well, but it seems like the big two are that texture and organic matter piece of influencing how much is available. You actually can apply metribuzin at 2 ounces up to tasseling. You will probably see some crop response there, but if you find yourself in a rescue situation, that could be an option. And the max total rate for any season is 5 1/3 ounces. We also get questions about layered residuals, and this story is sort of similar to the story that we looked at in going from 2 to 3 effective herbicide sites of action with our residual product. These data come, again, these studies were funded by the Soybean Commission, but we're looking at, we've got about 10 site years there. We looked at with and without layered residual herbicides, a couple of different row spacings in each of these studies, and in a handful of these studies, there were even a couple of different planting dates, okay? So the data here shows that when you use that layered residual herbicide, you do get less variability, right? You kind of take the bottom end out of that data set when you use that layered residual herbicide compared to without the layered residual herbicide. Now, statistically, we couldn't get these weed control values to separate in any of these locations, but we do see a tighter grouping of our data and less risk when we include that layered residual herbicide. We also looked at layered residual herbicides this year in corn. The study was done in partnership with Syngenta. And what this data set is suggesting is that as long as you get that layered residual herbicide on within 35 days of planting, you did see an improvement in pigweed control. Okay, the sweet spot here for morning glory, because it tends to kind of break a little bit later than some of the pigweed, was that 21 to 35 day range there. The last thing I want to talk about here really is in relation to the increased use of glufosinate. There are a lot of generic glufosinate formulations or Liberty, right? Generic Liberty formulations out on the marketplace today. And we know that we need high temperature, high humidity, high sunlight to make these applications work. It's listed right there on the label. One of the things that I think folks should be considering here as they're looking at this is rather than um, going by that rule of thumb of temperature plus humidity equals 150, it would be good to start thinking about this measurement called delta T. So delta T does a better job of accounting for the role of humidity because it measures the droplet evaporation rate on the leaf surface. Okay. We know that with Liberty, one of the key things, one of the key reasons we need that high humidity is to keep that droplet liquid on the leaf surface for as long as possible. That's part of why AMS is so important, and definitely part of why humidity is important. So delta T tells us how long that droplet's going to stay wet on the leaf surface. The ideal range is the green shaded area on this chart. So that would be between about 4 and 14 in the Fahrenheit scale. When you look at that chart, delta T values that are less than 4 and more than 14 tend to have lower weed control. We can expect lower weed control. The yellow shaded region on the chart suggests that if you can increase your droplet size to slow down that evaporation rate, you can probably still make some reasonably effective applications. But the red zone there, anytime we have exceptionally hot, dry periods, I get a question about when should I just park my sprayer because it's so hot, this application isn't going to do any good anyway. And the answer to that question is the red zone here on this chart. So when those delta T values get above 22 roughly, where can you find information about delta T? It's on a lot of different weather stations. So the mesonet stations are equipped to calculate delta T. I have cajoled the folks at the mesonet enough times and begged and pleaded and hassled and annoyed and poked and prodded. They have agreed to give us a delta T tool on the mesonet, similar to the inversion tool that folks can use. They're kind of holding off on getting some updates done on the website before they make a new page, so they don't make it and then have to turn around and update it right away, which I respect that. But also my team gets delta T values just from a handheld weather station. So a lot of the handheld weather stations that you really should have for, especially as we think about these over-the-top dicamba applications for collecting um, real-time data in the field, those handheld weather stations can give us delta T values. And I misspoke there. The new labels for over-the-top dicamba actually talk about looking at the forecast for um, temperature thresholds with the National Weather Service. You do still need to collect data at the sprayer for wind speed. Anyway, back to thinking about glufosinate and conditions. One thing to think about when we're making glufosinate applications is that we spend so much time focused on what happens on the day of application. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that actually it's the conditions around those days that have a greater impact. So these data look a little funny. They come from a young man named Chris Landau who took about 25 years worth of herbicide evaluation trial data from University of Illinois, K-State, Mizzou, Arkansas, Wisconsin, a wide range of geographies, and looked at glufosinate applications and what variables predicted successful weed control. And so the panel on the far left is water hemp, and the factors shaded in purple were the ones that were statistically significant there. So take a look. Those factors include total rainfall and average temperature up to 5 days after the application. So even though we think of glufosinate as being a contact herbicide, we do still have to have the herbicide getting into the plant and the plant functioning properly for that herbicide to work. So 5 days after application, and then average temperature 5 days before application, right? We're conditioning that plant to behave a certain way based on the environment that it's in. So just, thinking about how do we adjust our applications in terms of spray volume, droplet size, AMS rate, needs to look at more than just that day of application. It needs to consider about a 10-day window really on the forecast when we're looking at application conditions to try to maximize glufosinate efficacy. And speaking of ammonium sulfate, it's kind of hard to talk about glufosinate without talking about ammonium sulfate. The label recommendation for AMS is 1.5 to 3 pounds per acre. However, I do know that many commercial applications and many farmers are using up to 5 pounds per acre of AMS when they know they're making applications in challenging conditions. So I think that's an important piece of information to make folks aware of. The other thing here that is important is that if it's not AMS, it's not AMS when we're talking about glufosinate applications. If you are using AMS as a water conditioner to prevent that antagonism with the cations and hard water, there are some replacements that can help us with that. But when we're talking about glufosinate, we are trying to work on hard water antagonism, but we're also trying to increase the absorption rate by changing properties of the leaf surface. And also, AMS can act as a humectant, which basically means it helps that droplet stay wet longer. So if it's not AMS, it's not AMS. If you have AMS in a combination product, just make sure that you know how much AMS you're putting on in that product so you can get to rates that are appropriate for glufosinate to work well. The data set that I pulled here, they're looking at velvet leaf control. Velvet leaf, because of some characteristics of the leaf surface, is a really good herbicide to look at AMS or a good weed rather to look at AMS interactions with. So what they did is they had velvet leaf, they had glufosinate, they were looking at AMS substitutes. Okay. If you look at the horizontal lines on that chart, the top black line represents the weed control that they achieved when they used a 2% AMS solution. The second one is a 1% AMS solution, and that lower black line that's at about 45% control is what the weed control that they observed with no adjuvants added. The bars represent the different products. Some of those products, guys, the application would have been just as well off to have included no adjuvant because the weed control that they attained with their AMS replacement was the same as not adding an adjuvant. Okay, so yes, there's a place for combination products. Yes, there's a place for AMS substitutes, but Liberty applications is not it. Okay. The last thing I've been talking about here a little bit this winter, and this is something that we've not proven out in the field here in Kansas. I'm especially interested to do this and to look at this maybe on even some PPO resistant weed populations, I think would be exciting. But we do know that we see increased activity when we apply glufosinate or Liberty with PPO inhibiting or group 14 herbicides. Okay. In fact, in the case of glufosinate plus sharpen, we see greater weed control than the additive effect. So if you take that 25% control with glufosinate and add, let's say that's 15% control with sharpen alone, here we get more, we get almost 90% control when we apply glufosinate with saflufenicil. Okay, so we think there's some potential here to look at some of these PPO inhibiting herbicides to enhance and maybe kind of stabilize the effectiveness of glufosinate activity. So, something worth trying if you're in a situation and you can find the product at the right price. So, wrapping things up here, not a lot of new products coming for 2026. We are, looking at some things that might be here in the near future. You saw the list earlier. There's even additional products that are not on that list. I do have concerns about PPO tolerance in our kochia populations. And then just that reminder to keep at least 2 effective herbicides in every single application. If you can give me 3, that's even better. So with that, thank you for listening to this recording. And if you have questions or follow-up, reach out to your local extension office, or here's my email address. If you're interested in the podcast, there's the name The War Against Weeds podcast. You can find it in iTunes, Spotify, pretty much any place you listen to podcasts. And then I think the last thing to point out here is if you are not receiving the Agronomy e-update, the weekly email newsletter from the agronomy department at K-State, it's a great resource to keep up on things related to weed management as well as general agronomy and other pest control tips and reminders.